Hi everyone, I'm Liz Stincelli and I'm here today with Beth Strathman. She is our leadership and team coach, and she's kind of a team and leadership specialist, and we have some team questions that we want to talk to her about today. We spoke on an earlier video about teamwork and some issues that we have on teams, but there's so much to cover that we wanted to touch base on a couple more questions. So thank you for joining me again today, Beth. So let's get right to it. How do I get my team to participate in meetings instead of having parking lot conversations afterwards? And what does that mean, and how does that affect my organization?
Well, I think it never hurts, and we talked about this in the previous video. It never hurts to keep in mind what your stakeholders need from you, right? So, as a team, your stakeholders need you to use your meeting time wisely, for example, and to talk about things that are going to, create more beneficial impact for them down the road. So, having that in mind, that kind of goes back to purpose, et cetera, that we talked about last time. And I think emanating from your purpose are also maybe some values that the team has, and maybe they come from, the company at large. But your team could also have a couple of its own values that it believes will enable it to work and serve its stakeholders. And from those values, creating behavioral norms and defining them in a way that say, this is something we value, and this is behavior that reflects that value, and this is behavior that doesn't reflect that value. And it's possible that your team needs to really talk about some kind of norm around really saying, what you mean or what you need to say in meetings. It also goes back to the psychological safety stuff that we've talked about before, right? People don't speak up in meetings because perhaps they don't feel safe to do so. For whatever reason, whatever the dynamic is amongst the team, people don't speak up. So instead of speaking up, they wait till after the meeting, and then they go off in little groupings sometimes and have these side conversations about all the things they would have said in the meeting but didn't. you know I think as a team leader, if you get wind of that dynamic happening, you have to address it head on with the individuals. Sometimes those individuals will come to you and say, I didn't want to say this in the meeting, but whatever it is, dot, dot, dot. And that's the perfect opportunity for the team leader to say, I'm concerned that you didn't, speak up in the meeting. After all, that's why we get together, so that we can have fruitful discussions about the issues. How can I help you? What do are you saying that we should not have decided what we decided in the meeting because we didn't have the benefit of what you had to say? Is that fair to the team? What's your solution now for having created this conundrum, whatever it is, because you didn't speak up in the meeting when it was the appropriate time to do so? Also, as a leader, you have to be very circumspect about, are you creating the psychological safety for people to speak up? That's kind of what's coming up for me right now on that particular question. What would you add?
The only thing I think I would add, Beth, is that if you're asking your team members to speak up in meetings, then you have to make sure that they are being heard in meetings. Because if they're speaking to a wall, that they're going to stop. Eventually they will give up, and there's no point in me speaking up. No one listens. No one gives me any feedback. No one engages in conversation. They don't listen to me. They don't take any of my advice. They don't, nothing I said that I say is considered. So why waste my time, and why put my neck out there if they obviously don't care what I have to say. So we have to make sure that if we're asking them to speak up, that they are being heard.
Right. And part of that might be the being heard part is um, intentionally asking, there are quieter members on teams sometimes. They just don't feel the need to speak up unless they've really noticed that something isn't being said. Are they just naturally tend to be more reflective, and they may not think of what they want to say, in the meeting. But one thing perhaps is to directly, ask those quieter members, things like, what's your take on this? Or even, what have you noticed about the dynamics in the room as we've been talking about this, right? So then, you can get even into a deeper conversation about, well, there seems to be some tension around this idea. I'm not sure that we've really hit on what we ought to do in the final analysis, because I'm sensing that not everybody's completely on board with it, So you can, help people participate in the conversation in that way and be heard in different ways around whatever the issue is.
And speaking of issues and tension, that leads us right into our next question. So, how do we know if our teams are having the right amount of conflict? Maybe we feel like we're having too much conflict, too little conflict. Maybe people are holding grudges. Maybe conflict's never resolved. Conflict. This is a thing that becomes a cancer in teams sometimes. So, what are your thoughts on conflict and teamwork?
Well, I think as a person who doesn't mind conflict, right? I know there are other people who it's very disturbing, emotionally disturbing to be around disagreement that has a lot of energy behind it, right? So when I think of conflict, I don't necessarily think of screaming and yelling, but I think a lot of people think about screaming and yelling at each other. So let's just be clear from the get-go that conflict is, to me, not seeing things the same way, but being able to handle that tension without becoming emotionally reactive, right? And sometimes that's very hard because people can get very passionate about their perspectives. But once again, keeping the stakeholders and their needs in the middle of your focus when you're having these discussions is a good thing. So I keep coming back to things like that. The psychological safety needs to be in place. We've talked about that almost in every question. That's a really important concept for teams. But I think learning how, as a team, to not just debate issues. Debate meaning I've got to win this argument, right? I've got to put my perspective out there and I've got to win. And not just even discuss things. When you're in a discussion, you're a little bit open to changing your mind. And usually what results is some kind of compromise, if you're just in a discussion. You give a little, you get a little, that kind of thing. But to really engage in dialogue, which is to go much deeper and to really be much more open to seeing things from a different perspective and being willing to let go of the position that you might be taking at the outset. And that is a skill that most teams don't have. Really, Liz, if you think about it, when just in our growing up and our schooling and our employment throughout our careers, how much dialogue were we trained to engage in or actually did engage in? Not a lot for me, I can tell you that. I think most of the time we're trained to argue our point and to win it. So learning how to engage in dialogue and understanding that a dialogue goes through different stages, starting with, at first you're polite, right? So this is the team that's not engaging in conflict because we don't like conflict. And so we just stay very polite with each other. On the outside, we are like, okay, and then maybe we give in too much. We don't say what's really on our mind, et cetera, et cetera. But then we don't really, if things start to get even a little bit tense, which in the 4 stages of dialogue, the next one would be breakdown, meaning like that whole politeness is starting to fade away and you're starting to hear people disagree with each other. Most teams don't like breakdown right? For all the reasons that we've been talking about with conflict. And so they go right back to politeness. It's like, okay, well, maybe we can table this discussion for another meeting. Or, okay, you can have whatever you want. Let's just all go back to being polite, right? And what you really need to do is stay in the breakdown long enough that you can start to really hear people's different perspectives and what's underlying those different perspectives. Why are they disagreeing? What assumptions are they making? What values are really important to them? All those kinds of things. And then get to the point where you can move out of the breakdown go up to inquiry, where you're really starting to ask questions about, well, hey, how come what's really underlying this? Why is this so important to you? Well, this is what's important to me. How can we come together and make that fit? What's going to really serve the stakeholder in this case? That kind of thing. And then get more into flow. So moving through those 4 stages of dialogue, from polite, breakdown, inquiry, and flow, is really that is something that teams, if they can learn that and practice it, be more aware of it, they could handle conflict more. And that is a lot that I just said. So what would you like to add?
No, that's a great point, and we're not taught to do that. It's it's something that takes practice, and when we don't follow through those 4 stages, it leads to those parking lot conversations. So someone is going to be talking about this conflict at some point. So do we want it to be constructive conversation, or do we want it to be conversations that start to tear our teams apart? I also think the type of conflict that we're having is important. I think it's important to recognize that. Is it because, is it a task-based conflict? Is it a work styles conflict? Is it a personality conflict? Because different types of conflict require different levels of attention. Conflict is what challenges us to look at things in new ways. So conflict can be great, but we have to learn to harness it instead of letting it break us down and keep us broken down. We need to, as you said, break down and then push on through.
Right. Yeah. And to really appreciate that there are different perspectives and everybody sees a slightly different piece of the issue, and it's how to take all those different pieces and come up with a much better, well-rounded view of what's going on and what needs to be done to move things forward. People should not be afraid of conflict. We need to get used to it. We need to do it better. We need to understand it better. And that takes a lot of work.
It takes work, and it takes the willingness to be vulnerable.
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
don't have to win. We don't always have to be right.
Right. Correct. Well, that's what we have for you today, mostly around communication and conflict. And so let us know what your experience is, or what other questions you might have about teams, communication, conflict, team meetings, all that kind of thing. We were happy to engage with you and provide what we think are some possible answers. Thanks.